The winter of 1918 lay heavy upon the lonely hill of San Giovanni Rotondo. Night had fallen like a great veil of iron, sealing the friary in a silence so deep it seemed almost alive. The wind, sharp as broken glass, hurled itself again and again against the ancient stone walls, making the wooden shutters tremble as though under the weight of unseen hands. Snow drifted across the courtyard in restless spirals, gathering in corners like ghosts seeking shelter from the cold. Inside, the corridors were dim and narrow, carved from the same pale stone that had witnessed centuries of whispered prayers. The cold crept stubbornly through every crack, chilling even the flames of the candles that lined the walls. Their weak golden light flickered violently, stretching long trembling shadows across the flagstones, shadows that swayed like cloaked figures lingering just outside the reach of sight. In a small prayer room near the end of the hall, Padre Pio knelt before a worn wooden crucifix. It was close to midnight. The world outside roared with the winter storm, but within those walls he remained perfectly still, immersed in prayer, his lips moving silently, his breath visible in the frigid air. His hands, clasped tightly together, trembled not from the cold, but from the weight of souls he carried in his heart. The silence was not empty. It was thick, sacred, almost expectant. Padre Pio had often said that the nights in the friary were never truly quiet, that the suffering souls of Purgatory wandered closest during hours when men slept. Tonight, the air felt especially heavy, as though something unseen pressed gently against the world. A gust of wind howled down the stone corridor, rattling the iron lanterns and making the flames dance with sudden panic. The shadows quivered along the walls, then froze in unnatural stillness. Padre Pio lifted his head. A chill passed over him, not the cold of winter, but something deeper, older. Something was coming, something that did not belong to the living world. The candle at Padre Pio's side sputtered weakly as he rose from his knees. Hours of prayer had passed unnoticed, swallowed by the stillness of the storm-torn night. He made the sign of the cross, his features calm, and pushed open the wooden door of the prayer room. It groaned softly on its hinges, the sound unusually sharp in the silence. The corridor beyond was a long stone passageway, narrow and dim, stretching into shadows that swayed like living things. Padre Pio stepped into the hall. His sandals whispered against the cold floor, each step echoing far more loudly than it should have. The air felt dense, thick enough to touch, like a curtain hanging between the visible world and something hidden just behind it. He paused, sensing the subtle shift he had come to recognize. A presence, or many. Padre Pio often said that the dead walked the corridors of the friary more frequently than the living. He once explained softly, "They come for prayers. They come seeking mercy." To others, such words were unsettling. To him, it was a simple truth, one woven into the fabric of his priestly life. Tonight, that truth pressed in around him from every direction. The temperature seemed to drop with every step he took. The faint light of the lanterns trembled as though disturbed by invisible hands brushing past them. The wind outside moaned along the outer walls, but the sound within the hallway was different, deeper, almost like a pulse in the stone. He walked slowly, his fingers trailing along the rough surface of the wall. The silence felt expectant, as if the entire friary were holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that follows a question, not an answer, one that waits for something to appear.
As Padre Pio reached the midpoint of the corridor, he halted. Something had shifted behind him, a faint pressure in the air, like the brushing of a sleeve or the movement of someone trying to avoid being seen. He turned his head slightly. Nothing. Only the quivering lantern light reflecting off cold stone. Yet the atmosphere grew heavier, pressing lightly against his chest, as though unseen eyes were watching him from just beyond the edge of reality. He had felt this many times, the nearness of souls who lingered between suffering and salvation. They rarely appeared visibly, but their presence was unmistakable, each carrying a weight of longing and sorrow. Padre Pio whispered, "May God grant you peace," not knowing to whom he was speaking, only that someone was there, listening. He moved forward again, his steps slower now. The wind outside crashed violently against the shutters, making them clatter like bones. But inside the corridor, a new sound rose, soft, hesitant, out of place. A shuffle, a rustle, almost like the dragging of a worn habit along the floor. Padre Pio stopped mid-step, his breath catching in the cold air. The sound repeated, slightly louder this time, coming from the far end of the hall where the shadows thickened like ink. It was not the wind, nor the settling of old wood, nor any living footstep he knew. Something, or someone, was moving in the darkness. The friary, already ancient and haunted by decades of whispered prayers, seemed to shift around him. The air vibrated faintly, as though reality itself had trembled. Padre Pio stood utterly still, listening, his heart steady but alert. Then came a second sound, sharper, clearer, impossible to mistake. A knock, not on wood, on stone. One single deliberate knock that echoed down the corridor like a warning from the other side of death, and it made Padre Pio stop in his tracks. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. Padre Pio stood perfectly still, his ears straining toward the far end of the hallway where the shadows deepened into a black, impenetrable pool. The faint rustle he had heard moments before dissolved into silence, as though whatever had moved now waited, hidden just beyond sight. The cold pressed in against him, needling through the thick fabric of his habit, chilling his skin beneath. Then, bang! A single thunderous knock crashed through the hallway. It struck the stone walls like a hammer on an iron door, reverberating with a deep, hollow resonance that seemed to travel straight through Padre Pio's chest. His heart jolted, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the sound. It felt ancient, deliberate, and impossibly loud for a quiet monastery at midnight. Before he could draw a full breath, bang! The second knock fell harder than the first, echoing down the corridor with a startling clarity. It was not the sound of a fist on wood, it was something heavier, something that did not belong to mortal hands. The cold vibrated through the stones beneath his feet, shuddering the lanterns until their flames sputtered in panic. Padre Pio felt the air thicken, as though the world had narrowed to a single point, the door at the end of the corridor. His breath released in a thin fog. His pulse slowed. He knew, with a certainty born of years touched by the unseen, that this was no visitor of flesh and blood. Yet he did not move, not until the third knock fell. Bang! The sound tore through the silence like a rupturing of the night itself. It was not merely a noise,
It was a summons, a desperate, pleading call wrapped in the force of a soul who could not speak through living words. The entire corridor shook, the candles flickering wildly, throwing frantic shadows that twisted in long, distorted shapes across the stone floor. Padre Pio inhaled deeply. The cold air burned his lungs, but his steps remained steady. No one in the monastery should be awake at this hour. No visitor would travel the mountain roads in a storm like this. No person, living or breathing, could have struck the door with such unnatural strength. Yet, someone waited.
He began to walk. Each footstep echoed unnaturally loud, tapping through the hall as though amplified by unseen chambers below. His fingertips brushed the wall for steadiness. The stone felt strangely warm, as if the entire friary had absorbed the shock of the knocks. As he approached the door, the temperature plummeted. His breath thickened into a white cloud. The flame of the lantern nearest the door guttered, bent sideways as if pushed by an invisible gust, then steadied into a small, trembling point of gold. Padre Pio paused only once, long enough to whisper a prayer beneath his breath. "Lord, grant peace to the restless." The words vanished into the cold air as though swallowed. He reached the door. From the outside, it led to an old storage room long unused. The wood was worn and darkened by age. The iron hinges rusted, the handle chilled to the touch. Yet in this moment, the door pulsed faintly with an unnatural presence, as if holding its own heartbeat. Padre Pio lifted his hand, and for the first time that night, he felt it, a tremor in his fingers.
Not of fear, but of knowing that when he opened this door, the world would not be the same. His palm pressed against the cold wood. The contact sent a chill racing through his arm, up to his shoulder and into his spine. The silence behind the door was so absolute it felt like a void. But Padre Pio sensed something waiting, something ancient, sorrowful, and unbearably lonely. He drew in a breath, steady but slow. Then, gently, he pushed. The door resisted at first, groaning under its own weight. The hinges screamed softly, as though protesting his courage. Inch by inch it opened, releasing a draft of icy air that washed over him. And then, creak. The sound elongated, echoing into the vast emptiness of the room beyond. The crack widened, letting a sliver of darkness spill into the corridor. It was not the ordinary darkness of night, but a thicker kind, velvety, dense, and strangely luminous at its edges, as if something within it breathed. Padre Pio held the door open, his silhouette framed in the trembling candlelight. His eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, searching for movement, for form, for any sign of life or death. The wind outside wailed suddenly, rattling the shutters along the building. But inside the room, there was nothing. Only the darkness waiting. And yet Padre Pio felt it unmistakably, the presence of someone who had knocked, someone who could not be seen, someone who had crossed a boundary no living man could cross. He stepped forward, the door creaking wider, preparing himself to face whatever soul awaited him within. The air thickened, pressing close, and the faint scent of cold earth drifted past him. Someone was there, and it had called his name through 3 thunderous knocks.
The door groaned open, slowly,
as if pushed by an unseen hand. Padre Pio felt a gust of air colder than anything the winter night had offered. It swept past him like a breath from a crypt, raising every hair on his arms. He held the lantern higher. A figure stood in the threshold. At first, Padre Pio thought it was simply a monk from the friary caught wandering the halls in the late hours. But as the flame steadied, details sharpened, and the shape before him grew more unsettling. It was an elderly friar, his body slightly bent, his hands trembling as though from exhaustion from a long, painful journey. His face was thin, almost hollowed, with deep shadows beneath his eyes. His beard, gray and unkempt, hung over a chest wrapped in a habit so old it seemed from another century. The fabric was torn in places, stained with something Padre Pio could not name, and when the old monk shifted, the hem of his robe did not touch the ground. Padre Pio's breath caught. The lantern light passed through the monk's sleeves for a heartbeat, like light filtering through fog. This was no living man. Still, the figure bowed his head in a gesture of respect, his voice emerging as a hoarse whisper that seemed to echo from far behind him. "Father Pio, forgive the disturbance."
Padre Pio swallowed, fighting the instinctive tightening of his chest. "Who are you, brother?" The monk lifted his gaze. His eyes held a sorrow that felt ancient, like grief that had waited decades for release. They shimmered with something wet, not tears, but a kind of spiritual ache. "I once lived in this monastery," he said quietly. "Many years ago, long before your time." Padre Pio felt the cold deepen. The friary had been built centuries earlier. Countless monks had lived here. Many had died here. But their names, their stories, their sins, only God still held them all. "What do you seek?" Padre Pio asked, stepping closer, though his heart trembled. The old monk raised his hand, thin, translucent, shaking. "I seek mercy," he whispered. Padre Pio's voice softened. "Tell me." The monk's face contorted with pain. "During my life here, I failed my vows, not in ways the world would judge gravely. I served, I prayed, I wore this habit faithfully. But my heart was divided. I neglected sacrifices. I avoided duties. I chose comfort when the rule demanded discipline. I hid my faults from my brothers. I died with these stains upon my soul." He lowered his head. "And so I remain, waiting, hoping." A tremor ran through him, not of cold, but of spiritual agony, like a flame burning too long. Padre Pio felt compassion rise within him. "Brother, how long have you waited?" The monk looked up, and the lantern flickered violently, as if his words blew through the flame. "More than a century."
A sharp ache pressed into Padre Pio's chest. To suffer for even a moment in purification was painful beyond earthly measure. Yet this soul had endured 100 years of longing for God, 100 years of darkness, 100 years of regret. "What has kept you here?" Padre Pio asked gently. "A mass," the monk whispered. "A single mass for my soul was promised by a fellow friar, but he forgot. He meant no harm. Life is easily distracted, but without that prayer, I was left wandering." Padre Pio closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the depth of sorrow in the monk's voice. The old friar took a slow, shuddering breath. Frost formed slightly on the wooden doorframe as he exhaled. "When you saw your light tonight, Father Pio, hope awoke in me. I dared believe someone might finally hear my plea. Padre Pio stepped fully into the doorway, the lantern between them casting strange shadows over the stone walls. Despite the fear in his veins, his voice held the calm authority of a confessor. "Brother, you are not forgotten. God does not abandon his children. Tell me, what is it that you ask?" The monk sank to his knees, his form flickering like a flame fighting to stay alive. "Please, offer a mass for me, just one. It will be enough. It will free me." For a moment, silence filled the corridor. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Padre Pio nodded slowly. "I will offer the Mass tomorrow morning." The monk's face transformed, like dawn breaking through a storm. Light flickered in his eyes, fragile but radiant. "Bless you, Father Pio." Then he faded. First his breath, then his hands, then the outline of his robe. Within seconds, the doorway was empty. Only the cold remained. Padre Pio stood alone in the darkness, lantern trembling in his grasp, knowing that what he had witnessed was not a dream, not an illusion, but a soul who had been waiting in silence for a century. And tomorrow, that silence would finally end.
Padre Pio stood frozen in the corridor, long after the old monk's apparition had vanished. The lantern flame trembled, as though still reacting to the presence that had filled the hallway moments before. Yet the cold remained, not the natural chill of winter stone, but the lingering ache of a soul that had carried its suffering for far too long. Then, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, a voice spoke again behind him. "Father Pio." Padre Pio turned. The monk had returned, not fully, not with the same sharpness of form, but as a pale silhouette hovering in the dimness. His face seemed more fragile now, as though the weight of what he wished to confess held him between appearing and fading altogether. Padre Pio steadied himself. "You may speak, brother. I am listening." The monk bowed his head. "Thank you. I have waited so long for an ear willing to hear the truth." He took a step forward, though his foot made no sound against the stone floor. The hem of his ancient habit still hovered above it, untouched by the physical world. When he lifted his gaze, the shadows under his eyes seemed deeper, almost carved into his soul. "I once lived in this monastery, and I died here, many, many years before you arrived." The words carried no bitterness, only a weary acceptance. His voice trembled like an old bell struck gently after decades of silence. "What keeps you bound here?" Padre Pio asked. The monk sighed, a sound like a cold wind brushing through fallen leaves. "A fault," he whispered. "A small one, perhaps, in the eyes of men, but grave in the eyes of heaven, because I carried it with stubbornness." Padre Pio waited, offering the stillness of a confessor. The monk continued, "When I lived here, I was entrusted with a humble duty. I was to tend the candles in the chapel. Each evening, I was responsible for ensuring the flame before the tabernacle never went out. It was a simple task, quiet, unnoticed, and sacred." He closed his eyes, pain tightening the edges of his fading form. "But I grew careless. I grew comfortable. I let the routine become burdensome to my pride. There were nights, too many, when I allowed myself to say, 'It is enough. Someone else will notice. Someone else will tend it.'" His voice cracked. "One night, the flame died." He opened his eyes, and the sorrow in them glimmered like frost catching the lantern light. No one saw my negligence. I hid it behind words and duties. I prayed more loudly the next morning to drown the whisper of my conscience. But God saw. He sees everything. Padre Pio felt the weight of the confession settled between them. A single act, overlooked by men but known by God, the kind of fault that leaves a soul restless. The monk's voice grew softer. When I died, I expected mercy to lift me swiftly into light, but I had not repented, I had not humbled myself, and pride is a chain that binds tighter than iron. He wrapped himself around him, shivering with a cold that did not belong to earthly winters.
My purification has been long. I have walked in silence through halls no living ear can hear. I have waited in a realm where time does not comfort. Patience is demanded, but consolation is distant.
Padre Pio stepped closer, the lantern casting warm, trembling circles across the stone. "And all this time," he said gently, "you waited for someone to hear your confession?" "Yes," the old monk breathed, "for someone who would understand that small sins, when ignored, when excused, can grow into walls that separate the soul from God." A flicker of light passed right through the monk's chest as he continued. "My brothers prayed for me when I died, but no one prayed for the hidden fault I carried within, not until tonight, when heaven allowed me to appear before you." The flame of the lantern wavered violently, as if responding to the gravity of his words. "I have been so lonely, Father Pio. The place of purification is not like the world imagines. There is no fire as mortals know it, no chains or monstrous shadows. There is only longing, deep, painful, unending longing for the face of God, and the knowledge that one's own choices caused the delay." Padre Pio felt tears rise, not of fear, but of compassion. "Brother, mercy is greater than your fault. God asked only that the truth be spoken." The monk's form brightened faintly, as though a thin veil had been lifted from him. "Your presence, Father Pio, it is more than I deserve, yet God willed it. He willed that I confess what I refused to see in life." Padre Pio lifted the lantern. The warm light reached the monk's face, illuminating the lines of exhaustion etched across it. "What would you have me do?" The monk lowered himself slowly to his knees, though his weight did not bend the floor beneath him. "Offer a mass for me," he whispered. "A single mass will break the last chain. It will let me see the light I have longed for through a century of darkness." Padre Pio placed a hand over his heart. "I will offer it," he said, "tomorrow morning." The monk exhaled, a sound like the softest release of a burden carried too long. His edges began to blur, dissolving into a faint mist. "Thank you, Father Pio. The Lord has heard me through you." And with that, he faded once more, slowly, peacefully, like a candle finally allowed to burn clean. Only the flickering lantern remained, trembling in Padre Pio's hand, casting its small circle of warmth into the cold, silent corridor, where a soul had finally spoken the truth after 100 years of waiting.
The old monk's form flickered like a candle struggling against an unseen wind. His eyes, once dull with centuries of weariness, now held a fragile glimmer, a spark of hope that had not shone there in decades. Padre Pio watched him carefully, sensing the moment was sacred, suspended between two worlds. The monk lowered his head, his voice trembling as though drawn from the depths of his long suffering. "Father Pio, I ask for nothing grand, not relief from all sorrow, not a swift descent into glory." He lifted his gaze again, and the hope within it shone brighter. "I ask only for what my soul truly needs, a single prayer from your heart and one holy mass offered for me." He said it not with desperation, but with quiet certainty, like someone who finally understood the simplicity of heaven's justice. It was the request of a soul who had waited, suffered, and at last dared to hope for deliverance. Padre Pio felt his own heart stir. Such a small plea, yet heavy with eternity. He stepped closer, meeting the old monk's fading eyes. "I will pray for you," he said softly, "and tomorrow I will offer the Mass." At those words, the soul seemed to shine faintly, like dawn approaching after a night too long endured. The moment the words left Padre Pio's lips, "I will do it, brother," something shifted in the air. The cold that had clung to the corridor all night loosened its grip, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from the very stones. The old monk lifted his face, and for the first time since his appearance, his expression softened into something like peace. A faint shimmer spread across his form, blurring the edges of his silhouette. His habit, once heavy and dark, thinned like mist, dissolving in morning light. The lantern's glow passed through him more easily now, as if his body no longer belonged to the world that held it moments before. "Thank you, Father Pio," he whispered, his voice fading like an echo carried across a great distance. A sudden, gentle breeze swept through the hallway, impossible in a sealed stone corridor, stirring the flame of the lantern but not extinguishing it. The monk's form broke into soft trails of pale light, unraveling like strands of smoke drawn upward by an unseen wind. Within seconds, he was no longer a figure, only a faint brightness, then a shadow, then nothing at all. Warmth blossomed in the space he had occupied, subtle but unmistakable, the familiar sign Padre Pio had often associated with heavenly grace touching earthly air. He placed the lantern gently on the floor and dropped to his knees. With hands folded tightly, he bowed his head. "Lord, receive his soul," he prayed. The silence around him felt purified, as though heaven itself had paused to listen. Dawn crept silently over San Giovanni Rotondo, washing the friary walls in a soft, forgiving gold. The chill of the night had passed, but Padre Pio still felt its memory lingering in his chest, the cold of a soul suspended between longing and redemption. As he walked slowly toward the chapel to prepare for morning mass, his thoughts returned again and again to the old monk and his trembling request. He had seen many souls before. He had heard their quiet cries, their confessions whispered from beyond the veil, their longing for the light they once resisted. Yet each encounter struck him with fresh awe, as though God himself were reminding him, mercy never grows weary. In the empty chapel, Padre Pio knelt before the tabernacle. The sanctuary lamp flickered steadily, a flame guarded by generations of monks, including the one who had suffered so long for neglecting it.
Padre Pio bowed his head and felt a deep tenderness rise within him. How small the fault, he thought, and yet how great the mercy that pursues even such small shadows. He reflected on the truth he had witnessed throughout his priesthood. Heaven was not swift to condemn, nor indifferent to the quiet sins that slowly harden the heart. God saw everything: the moments of laziness, the pride hidden under pious actions, the duties brushed aside with a careless shrug. But he also saw the smallest sigh of repentance, the first spark of humility, the soul's trembling desire to return to him. That was why the old monk had been sent to him, not to terrify him, nor to display the severity of judgment, but to reveal once more the gentleness of divine love, a love that waited, a love that searched, a love that refused to abandon even those who had forgotten themselves.
Padre Pio lifted his head, his eyes warm with understanding. He whispered the words he had told so many, living and dead. God's mercy reaches further than our faults. It does not sleep. It does not turn away. He remembered his own famous saying, spoken countless times to the friars who marveled at the strange visitors who sought him. Day and night souls come to me, as many as the living. Some came weeping, some came silently. Some carried burdens they had never spoken aloud in life, but all of them carried the same hope, that someone on earth might help open the door to the mercy they longed for. As the first bell for Mass rang through the friary, Padre Pio rose with calm resolve. Today, one more soul would be freed. One more wandering heart would ascend into the light. And in that moment, he felt the truth settle gently over him like dawn itself. No soul is forgotten. No fault is beyond forgiveness. The mercy of God can reach even the most hidden, most wounded, most wandering spirit and bring it safely home.